Henry is going to tell us the story of these portraits. But one of the later chapters of their story is that Mike Miller, honorary member of the Society of the Ark and Dove, and incidentally, president of the Senate of Maryland, had them brought up here and restored and hung. I think most of you know Dr. Henry Miller, who is research director of Historic St. Mary's City, down the original capital of Maryland in St. Mary's County, and he is the quintessential historian of early Maryland and of the various branches of the Calvert family and of the people that we're going to be hearing about. Our great friend Aneta Georgievska-Shine is a PhD in Northern European painting and lectures at the Smithsonian and all over the place, takes groups of fancy people to nice places in Europe, etc. And she writes books, yeah, right. She writes important books about Rubens and Northern European painters. I should have brought one. And Henry is going to talk about the history of the people we're looking at, and then Aneta is going to interpret what the portraits are saying in the language of the artist, in the language of the time, and maybe compare and contrast with some other portraits by the same people, et cetera, et cetera. So please welcome Henry and Aneta.
We are here to talk about a fascinating group of portraits that we have, hopefully you've seen, all of them now. A group that, of course, are of the Lords Baltimore. And they truly are a treasure trove of information, of insight, and we'd like to go over that a little bit with you this morning. The reason they're probably here is in large part due to this fellow, Sir Robert Eden, the last proprietary governor of Maryland. But it's not because of him. It's because of his wife, Caroline Calvert Eden. And Caroline, for whom Caroline County is named in Maryland, obtained all the portraits of the Lords Baltimore when the family estate was sold by her brother in 1768. She took them to the Eden family home in County Durham, Windleston Hall, which is now unfortunately abandoned, but that was where for 160 or so years they were protected. We don't know where, but probably in one of these rooms here is where those portraits stood and were kept as a group. That was into the 20th century. And at that time, this man, Sir Timothy Calvert Eden, who was the 6th Baronet of Maryland, and his family, they were having financial difficulties, but they had maintained all the portraits there at the hall. And I point out the little boy at the bottom of that family picture there. He is still living, he's in his 90s. He is the 7th Baronet of Maryland. And I went, what the heck is a baronet? Okay, well, it's not a baron, but it's not a knight. It is a hereditary knighthood that's sort of squeezed in between. So the oldest son inherits the knighthood, or becoming sir. With a normal knight, it's you and doesn't pass on. So this is the one way the British have established to pass on a knighthood through the generations here. And being of Maryland, I think, is quite fascinating. But the family, as I mentioned, was having some financial difficulties. And in 1933, they decided to place the 6 Lord Baltimore portraits on sale at Sotheby's in London, 1933. The sale was occurred. 2 of them were acquired by unknown purchasers. Bids were not high enough for 4. So only Cecil Calvert and Charles V, Lord Baltimore, were the ones that were taken away. The rest went back to Sir Timothy Eden. And it's about this time that a very important figure steps onto the scene, a man named Hugh Hampton Young. Now, an extraordinary man. In the late 1880s, he went to the UVA to start college. And in 4 years, he received his BA, his MA, and his MD. In 4 years. There's nobody before, nobody since that ever has achieved that record. And today, many college students are on the 5-year plan for a BA. So I think that's even more remarkable here. He became chief of urology at Hopkins, founded basically that field, was a chair of many different committees, such as establishing BWI, but is a real philanthropist around America, or Maryland at least. He was in London in 1933 and heard about this auction. He assumed that Walter's Art Gallery would acquire the portraits, but alas, it didn't happen. So he contacted Sir Timothy Eden afterwards and asked him, would you be willing to sell the 4 unsold portraits to Maryland? And he got a reply back from Sir Timothy Eden. If they all go to America, I shall be well pleased, for I know that they will be appreciated there. Indeed they are. So he was also trying to get the others. They were unknown bidders, but he tracked down the 5th Lord Baltimore was sold to Lord Fairfax. And he offered Lord Fairfax a considerable increase over the value he paid if he would sell it to Dr. Young. Lord Fairfax replied, no, but not how you think. He said, no, I will not take a profit. I will sell it to you willingly because he was born in Prince George's County, Maryland, had a strong connection and feeling for this state, and became Lord Fairfax later. So Young was able to acquire 5 of the 6 portraits. They went on display at the American Museum in London in late 1933, were brought to the Atlantic, and for Maryland's 300th anniversary in 1933, they were all put on display in Baltimore. And then they went to the Enoch Pratt Library where they were held. But the Cecil Calvert was still missing. Finally, in 1940, Hugh Hampton Young made a deal nobody could pass up. If they could acquire the painting, which was then in the ownership of William Randolph Hearst, he would donate all the other 5 to the Enoch Pratt for the citizens of Maryland. That was finally achieved in 1940. And at last, on the opposite side of the Atlantic, in the months before America entered World War II, all the portraits were again united together. They were hung on the walls of the Enoch Pratt Library, where they remained for over 75 years. They were protected for the most part, but dust, grime, that sort of thing, of course, did their work. And finally, in 2016, as Jean mentioned, the Maryland legislature, with the strong influence of our Senate President Mike Miller, got money to have these conserved. And under the wonderful leadership of Elaine and Catherine at the Maryland State Archives, they oversaw that process of removing them and cleaning them up. I don't have many pictures of before and after. I tried to get some, but this will maybe give you sort of a clue of how different they looked. Just brilliant. You could see stuff you could never see before. For example, look at his layer of his sort of middle section of his body. Look at the detail that we now can see, we couldn't see before. Just an amazing job. So we need an entire analysis of this to go on, which is what we started here. But this gives us a wonderful ability to see what these were originally intended. And George Calvert, done by the court painter under James I and Charles I, Daniel Mightens, was an impressive figure. There's 2 portraits of him, actually, or 3. There's a copy of the one you just saw, but there's another in Sir Francis Bacon's collection, north of London, which shows him as the Secretary of State with correspondence and a wax seal at his hand. So this one, I think, might be the earliest of those. But let's focus on George himself. George began, of course, in the very rural part of northern England in Yorkshire, North Riding, grew up on a farm of a minor gentry family. Most people at that time would have become farmers and wouldn't have had much prospect. But George, luckily, was accepted at Trinity College, Oxford, where he went for his BA. Later, his son Cecil, of course, attended the same college. And by early 1600s, he became known to the most powerful man in England, next to the Queen, which was Sir Robert Cecil, Earl of Salisbury, Secretary of State for England, treasurer, a man who had incredible things to do. This is, on the left, is the earliest image of George, probably between 1610, 1615 at the Walters Art Gallery. And at the bottom is the oldest signature I can find of George Calvert from 1602. He started working as a servant for Cecil, began moving up, became a clerk, and eventually became noticed to a very significant individual, King James I. In fact, James became very impressed with the ability of George Calvert, and in 1619 appointed him, with his own decision, to become Principal Secretary of State. There was 2 Principal Secretaries of State at a time, and George served with 3 of them. What that meant is they managed all of the foreign affairs of Britain. George was regularly receiving reports from the ambassadors in Venice, in Madrid, in Paris, in The Hague. These were really significant runs, running the foreign affairs for the state under the direction of the king. So one of the most powerful positions in the entire colony. And part of that, he also had a very good income. And on the basis of that income, George, as we all know, acquired his boyhood home of Kipling Hall, built the wonderful mansion that still stands there as a mark of his success in life. And things were going really well, but James I wanted George to work on a certain project. He wanted to marry off the Duke of Wales, his son Charles, to the Spanish princess, the Spanish match. The reason was, if they married her, James would get a massive dowry, and he was money short. Okay? But he also thought that there was political meaning for it. So George worked very hard with the Spanish ambassador, with the people in Spain, trying to set up this match. But in 1623, Prince Charles and a disreputable companion of him, the Duke of Buckingham, traveled secretly to Madrid to meet with her. Charles was not impressed, and Duke of Buckingham thoroughly upset the entire court of Spain by his inaction. It fell apart. Later, of course, as we know, Charles married the French princess Henrietta Maria, but the Spanish match had a really bad effect. George lost power. He resigned in the end of 1624 and no longer served Secretary of State. But as you know, James had great respect for George Calvert, made him the Baron of Baltimore, of which this lovely patent of nobility still survives at the Maryland Historical Society. And George put his effort into colonization. He even wrote Charles I in a letter, I think it talks about it. He had undergone the freezing conditions of Newfoundland, which had sort of tempted him to stop plantations, but my inclination carrying me naturally to these kinds of works, I will further the best I may the enlarging of your majesty's empire in this part of the world. He was firmly dedicated to that effort and worked in Ireland, at County Wexford, at Clohaman, where he had the Newfoundland colony where he almost froze to death, and said, I want to place in new climes. And of course, that became the negotiations for Maryland. He succeeded in that, and at the request of Charles I, his queen, Queen Mary, was given the name of the colony. I'm very glad that she was called Queen Mary, because Henrietta Land just doesn't have the same resonance, does it? Okay. But anyway, unfortunately, he died before that could happen, and his son Cecilius had to take over. But now, let's go back to that painting by the major figure, one of the major artists in the court in this period. And now I'd like Aneta to take over and tell us more about the artwork of George Calvert.
Thank you. So I was reminded of this wonderful anecdote by Erwin Panofsky, the art historian who came here in the 30s, revolutionized art history as a discipline in America. And he said, historians and art historians can complement one another. The historian's business is to do reconstruction. Art historians have to take the reconstruction and add to that aesthetic recreation. For historians, works of art are primarily documents. For us, works of art are primarily monuments. Therefore, I would just like to take a minute or two and discuss each of these portraits as monuments, because in addition to telling us about this historical sequence, who was where, when, they also tell us about great artistic accomplishments, at least in a couple of cases. So when we talk about the first Lord Baltimore, George Calvert, the artist, as you can see here, is Daniel Maytens, who was born in 1590, lived quite a long life, and this particular artist was very, very successful at the English court. It's interesting to note that he was born in Delft, which is of course associated these days with Johannes Vermeer. And you see here a beautiful self-portrait of Maytens from around 1625. Now, when you compare the self-portrait to the portrait of George Calvert, you see notable differences stylistically, correct? This portrait is very soft, it's very individualized, it's very personal. This is a private portrait. There is, of course, never a purely private portrait in 17th century. It's always intended to be seen by some kind of ideal beholder. But when he paints himself, he can really attend to his likeness, to his character, to conveying emotion. When he paints the Lord, the first Lord Baltimore, he has to be much more rigid and official. And this is the first point I want to make, that when we look at these portraits, keep in mind their incredibly public, ceremonial function, their commemorative function. So when you say, why do they look so official and stiff? It's not because the artist couldn't do better. It's because the conventions of portraiture demand that certain sitters, under certain circumstances, have to be portrayed in very particular fashion. It's a small point, but it is important in order to remember why painters paint in a particular way. So, he was trained in Holland, in The Hague, under another portrait painter who is not a household name, but was very important at the time, Michel van Meerveld. But he spent most of his time in England, as you can see, and already by 1618, as a young man, he is working for one of the great art connoisseurs in England, the Earl of Arundel. And by 1620, he works for James I, and of course, as the label says here, he introduces a new elegance and sense of grandeur into English portraiture, especially in those full-length portraits. And that takes me to the notion of the full-length portrait. Full-length portrait. That's another thing we have to keep in mind when we speak about why portraits look a certain way in the 17th century. A full-length portrait, up until this period pretty much, was reserved only for royalty. High nobility, still half-length. The more important you are, the more of you will be preserved, so to speak. Truly. And of course, there are all these other conventions. Can you stand? Can you sit? Can you wear your crown? What do you rest upon? I mean, all of these are codes, visual codes, that are very carefully inserted in the portraits. And I'm showing you here a portrait, of course, of the Baltimore, Lord Baltimore, and next to it, Charles I, because for a period of time, between 1620 to around 1630, that decade, Maytens really is the most important court painter. And you can see that he also portrays Charles with that kind of elegance, restraint, very upright. And it's very interesting if you compare their poses to see that both of them They're standing, they're turning ever so slightly towards the beholder. They're projecting this sense of, I would say, they're higher than us. So this is something we also have to keep in mind, that you're always feeling, no matter how high they're placed, that they're looking down upon you, ever so slightly. They're recognizing you, acknowledging you as a sitter, but they are looking down a little bit. What else do you notice? You notice the red curtains as a device. This is a device that we will see in a couple of other portraits later on, and it's a device that goes back to Peter Paul Rubens, who introduces a lot of these full-length portraits, and especially Van Dyck. More about that later. But the red curtain, obviously, what it does in both of these portraits is it creates a sense of dynamism and flow and movement, because otherwise they're just standing like in a photographer's studio, very rigid. So those red draperies and curtains are super important because movement has to be restrained on the part of these very distinguished sitters, but at the same time, portraits need to feel lifelike and full of energy. So the curtain adds both nobility and energy in both cases. You also see that the curtains are pulled to the side in the case of Lord Calvert, and in a sense also when you look at the portrait of the king, right? Pulling to the side suggests something else. You may or may not know, but in 17th century, a number of paintings, especially in Holland and Flanders, would be covered with curtains. They were covered with curtains because they had a performative function. What that means is as you approach a portrait, you're almost invited to enter into another space as if in a theater, a curtain has been pulled and you are all of a sudden privileged to be in the presence of. In other words, there is a certain sense of mediation between you and the sitter in the portrait. He's not always there for you. The curtain has been drawn and he has appeared and now you can see him. So that's additional level of action that comes into the portrait. Then, of course, that dignity that's conveyed through their poses. One thing that you will notice in male portraits of the time is the arm akimbo. One arm is always at the waist, and it has this kind of angular quality. And that arm akimbo in Lord Baltimore's case suggests readiness for action. On the other hand, the other arm is relaxed. And that one has a glove. I cannot see if he's wearing glove on both of his hands, but oftentimes gentlemen in 16th and 17th century will have one hand in glove, another one ungloved. And you might say, okay, so what's the matter with the glove? Why are gloves so important? Of course, gloves are super important in portraiture because they're very, very high-level luxury item. Look at the king and his gloves over there. But secondly, you might say, why did the king want to show himself in gloves in this particular case? And there the crown, by the way, the crown and the hat are both placed at a table, right? It's very interesting because a portrait would look much more awkward if they had the hat and the crown, since the portrait painter has to capture the likeness. But you can never forget who they are. So you put the bishop's hat, you put the king's hat, you put the lord's hat, the cardinal's hat next to them, very prominent on the table to signify the station. Okay, but to go back to the glove, because this will come back as an element in portraits. The glove is one of the courtly attributes, obviously because it's such a high-level item of clothing, kid glove and all of that, soft and very elaborate. But secondly, gloves at court signify the quality that every proper courtier should have, which is reserve and restraint. You always speak almost through the glove. You're not super direct. You're not saying everything about yourself instantly. There are many treatises at the time when they talk about the fact that one of the greatest attributes that a courtier or a king should have would be this notion of prudence and reserve. So you're sort of always disclosing only an aspect of yourself. Let me move on. You can see that this kind of convention, the arm akimbo, The standing person is present in other portraits that he painted, Daniel Meitens. And this is from 1632, around the time when Van Dyck appears. And you can see repeated formulae of these red curtains that are being pulled to the side. In some instances, you see a view into a distance, of course, which enhances even more that notion of projection into three-dimensional space. And in many cases, when you see a view into distance, it can allude to the property, to the power of the person who is portrayed. But in the case of Lord Baltimore, it's a very, very much an interior setting, sort of like an office, like a cabinet. So it's very plain, very simple, in order to highlight him as a character. And I just wanted to mention, since we talked about the fact that Daniel Meitens had gone to England and worked for very important people from the get-go, Thomas Howard, the 14th of Arundel, and Alethea, the Countess of Arundel. And these are two wonderful portraits by the two of them. And you can see that they are seated, which is another sort of symbol of authority, but also relaxation and domesticity in this case. And they were incredibly important art collectors and influential also on the collecting habits of Charles I. And you may or may not know, but currently in England at the Royal Academy, the exhibition of the season has to do with Charles I and his collecting. So too bad we cannot be in London to see that right now. So, and one more example I want to show you of a courtier, another very important man at the time, who traveled to Spain on that Spanish mission in 1623, Endymion Porter. And you can see that in this case, I wanted you to look at this portrait for a moment vis-a-vis Lord Baltimore, because it's a little bit more lifelike. I mean, there is a little bit of rosiness in the cheeks and the white skin in the face, and it's because he is a sort of half-length figure. He can do all of those details. And of course, you can see that Meitens portrayed himself in a far more restrained, simple attire, whereas obviously the English nobility, especially Porter and Charles, are in this incredibly luxurious clothing. So, yes, Meitens was important until this young man showed up, right? Van Dyck. Anthony Van Dyck, the best student of Rubens, comes in 1632, settles in England, and from that time on, he contributes tremendously to the changes in British portraiture. But pay attention, Meitens is a Dutchman, and a couple of other people whom we will see will also not be English portrait painters. So the English continue to import painters throughout this period. So, can you just move on now? I think, oh, one more image I wanted to show you. That's Van Dyck's style, yes, this image. Endymion Porter by Daniel Meitens. Van Dyck's portrait. Self-portrait with Endymion Porter. So you can see what happens in portraiture when Van Dyck comes along. It's a completely new way of thinking about portraits. And this is something that will affect Meitens, and he will go back to Holland. Then he will come back to England and work there, but he becomes the principal painter at the court. So let's move on to the second lord from here.
Alrighty. We know that George Calvert has an untimely death in 1632. His son, Cecilius Calvert, becomes the second Lord Baltimore and is responsible for creating a unique social experiment on the shores of America. He succeeds in doing that, of course, and is a remarkable man. His most famous portrait, though, is the one that we see here with him with his grandson, his namesake, Cecilius, and a servant. And this portrait is one of the finest by Gerard Soest that was painted, I believe. Cecil is represented by Baltimore County and Cecil County in Maryland, so his name continues in that regard. The conservation of these paintings gave us the ability to really look at them in more detail. For example, you can see that he's holding a map that his grandson, who would, if he had lived, would have inherited the map of Maryland. Which map is it? But we want to look a little more carefully. The detail is very clear. It is a copy of the 1635 map of Maryland that was printed. This is the actual map of that era. And in 1670, when this painting was made, it was the only map available. A year later, Augustine Hermann's wonderful map would become available. And I think you can see the similarity there. The 35 map has all kinds of names of the rivers, of various places, of Clements Island, all that. All those are gone in this painting. There's only a few names that are given. One is right near the center, St. Mary's, Lord Baltimore's capital. The other in the lower left hand corner is Watkin Point, which is the boundary with Virginia on the eastern shore. He also lists the Potomac River because, as we know, George wisely had the south shore of that river be Maryland's boundary. And then, unlike the original map, along the top he has the latitude marks. And 40 is right at the upper right corner. The reason that's so significant is that was the legal boundary of Maryland, and the map is actually folded along the 40th parallel. So he's clearly showing this is Maryland and where its boundaries are. And look at the bottom. The map continues all the way into the Atlantic, because in 1670, Maryland not only included all of Delaware Bay, but the southern part of New Jersey all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. So he is representing what the colony was in 1670. And this is part of Cecil's insistent effort to try to build sense of place. A few years earlier, he had issued Maryland money in an effort to not only satisfy some of the coinage problems, but also make people living here begin to identify as people who call themselves Marylanders. So he very strongly urged and worked on that. And also something I want to mention about the paintings. This is the will. Brian Hissick did some marvelous transcriptions of many of these things. And in Cecil Calvert's will, I give to my son Charles Calvert, Esquire, which I desire may be by him left to his heirs, and so to be continued as an heirloom in the family, my father's picture at length in my house, I give to my son Charles Calvert. It is Cecil who I believe started the idea of having family portraits maintained throughout time for this family. And that is the portrait we know of him. And now I turn it over to Aneta to talk about this.
Okay. So what do we see in this portrait? Now we see a lot more of performance and action. It's wonderful how, actually this is also my favorite portrait in the series. It's by a very good painter, another very distinguished portrait painter of the time, Gerard Soest, who is also Netherlandish, and it is dated to around 1670. So it shows the second Lord Baltimore, Cecil, with his grandson, as we heard, and also a servant. Once again, pay attention. You have that red table with the hat, and you have the curtain that's being pulled back. And you have yet another element of dynamism in here, vis-a-vis the previous portraits, which is introduced by means of the servant who comes onto the stage to bring something. And of course, we are all very sensitive to this issue of the servant, and we really cannot qualify him other than as a servant. But let's keep in mind, I mean, this servant, dark-skinned servant, African boy, is dressed in very high-level clothing. And I want to just remind you that indeed, most of the courts in Europe would collect, so to speak, exotic specimens of humans from different parts of the world. In the Spanish court, they also loved people who were different in other respects, like if you look at Velázquez's Las Meninas, the famous painting with the dwarfs next to the Infanta, the princess. I mean, you can look at endless examples of exotic people that are brought to the court, and they would be servants or pages, but sometimes they could advance in their function as well. And the clothing of this servant boy suggests that he is closer to a page, so to speak. What I love here is, of course, the relationship between the grandfather and the grandson, and the idea of continuity, Maryland. And it's the little boy who also holds onto the map and points and puts his hand onto the map. In other words, it's conveyance of the territory and the land. In portraiture, it's very important that you have a sitter who makes that eye contact, and it should have been just the Lord. But in this case, that idea of legacy and continuation is so important for Cecil the Older that he wants the grandson to direct his attention towards us as well. You're wondering about the clothing of the grandson, I'm sure. Little boys and little girls were both dressed up until age 3 in dresses, essentially, because it was much easier to change the toddlers. And so little boys in many courts, not just in England, but we are talking about Spain, France, in Holland, they're dressed in these attires that look like little dresses. So that's what I wanted to mention, and especially the generational connection between the two of them. And I just want to mention one more thing, that Soest is also famous for this portrait of William Shakespeare, but of course he could never have painted Shakespeare from life. This is actually a portrait that was created on the basis of an earlier portrait. It has caused a lot of controversy. It is probably from the late 40s, early 50s, but it's considered relatively faithful because it may have been based on another earlier lost portrait. It also tells you about how important Shakespeare was at this time, that after his death, so many people were trying to create these portraits, even though it had to be posthumous and a reconstruction. And that leads me to one more point which I want to make, which is that what all the portraits do, obviously, is an attempt to bring the absent into presence. It has to do with death and memory, commemoration. And Cecil here is an older man with the grandson. And he wants that likeness and the difference in age to be captured between them. And if you go further here, I just want to show you a portrait by Van Dyck, one of the several fantastic portraits by Anthony Van Dyck we have at the National Gallery, which also shows a relationship between a child and a parent. In this case, it's a mother. We do not know who this Genoese lady is, but this is one of Van Dyck's great Genoese portraits that he painted between 1621 and 1626 when he was in Italy. And it is there in the National Gallery in a fabulous room of Van Dyck's that would be great to see this portrait side by side with that of Cecil Calvert in some exhibition down the road. You can see the red curtain appearing there in the distance. You will also see that in Cecil's case, it's still an interior. There you have a sort of transitional zone between interior and exterior, which you will see in some of the later of the Calvert portraits. But in this case of the Van Dyck portrait, people have suggested, even though we do not know who the lady is, that she may be dead, and that the child is looking towards us in order to ensure that we remember the mother. And why they think she's dead? Because she's distant, she's in profile, she turns to the side, and the child is the bridge between us and the mother. And also there is a little dog behind the kid that is a symbol of faithfulness, fidelity, and good memory. In Cecil's portrait, obviously both of them are alive, but with this awareness that things have to be passed down. He will not be here forever. So that gives it additional personal quality as opposed to the formality that we saw in the first portrait. One last point I want to make about this image is the carpet. You see the Oriental rugs in both cases? Oriental rugs are extremely precious. Up until the 17th century, they would only use them to cover tables. And the only place where you see an Oriental rug under a sitter up until the 17th century would be in sort of altarpieces where Virgin Mary is enthroned and there is an Oriental rug underneath her. They were extremely expensive imports from the Orient. The introduction of the Oriental rug in the Genoese portrait by Van Dyck, as well as in the Soest portrait of Cecil, obviously shows the luxury. But secondly, it supports further the notion of exoticism. Oriental rug plus the African page boy. So it kind of creates this more, how shall I say, worldly. It adds to the worldliness of Cecil here, the Oriental rug and the African page boy. And of course, that orientation towards the new country, the new land, global expansion. That's what's at stake here. I just want to show you a couple of other portraits by Soest that are very, very accomplished, so you can see that the portraits we have here are not important just to tell us about the lords. They are important as works of art. These are very, very good portrait painters, in a number of cases, whose portraits are avidly collected by museums. So here is William Fairfax. Here is portrait of a gentleman, possibly Sir Thomas Tipping from around 1660. It's a funny little portrait of this man with the dog. They look quite similar to one another. When you look at the physiognomies, the way they sit there, my dog, my horse, right? And then this is an interesting one. This is a Gerard Soest at the National Gallery. Just to tell you that this is a very well-regarded portrait painter, and that these portraits may need to be shown at some point next to the Van Dycks and other big portraits of the 17th century we have in Washington. So this one is at the National Gallery, and look at the marvelous drapery. Look at what he can do with textile, what he can do with fabric. This is a lady, it's a portrait, historiated portrait, so to speak, because while we know that she's a specific woman, she's also holding this shell, and in the shell there is a little pearl, and that always suggests Venus, and she's at a well or at a spring in nature, so it has this pastoral quality. So she's compared symbolically to the goddess of love and beauty, Venus, whatever we may think. But she is compared to the goddess of love and beauty, Venus. At any rate, so just to reinforce the idea that we are talking about important works of art here.
Well, very good. Well, as we know, Cecilius dies in 1675. His son, Charles, becomes the third Lord Baltimore. Charles County, Maryland, is named for him. And this is another painting by one of the more famous court painters of the time. There's several other images of Charles Calvert. One that is probably as a young man, I think 1660 or so, and another which is at Hook Manor in Wiltshire in the Arundel family, is again of around 1700. So there's several portraits we have of Charles Calvert. But if you go to that impeccable source of truth and justice, Wikipedia, you will find another portrait that claims to be Charles Calvert. But I ask the question, is this really Charles Calvert? It shows him holding a pair of dividers. To his right is a globe. There is a map on the table with a navigational instrument laying on it, and behind him, of course, a ship. This suggests someone who is into navigation, into maybe merchant activity, into exploration even. These are not things we typically associate with Charles Calvert and his other portrayals. So I said, let's look at this a little more carefully. But if we look at the portraits and compares it, the two portraits of Charles Calvert both show a double chin. Okay? There's not one on the other guy. Look at the other guy. He has a very prominent dimple in the middle of his cheek, his jaw. There's no dimples on the other two. And at the corner of the two Charles Calvert portraits, there's a vertical line, a wrinkle line. It doesn't show up on the other man. And this is the Calvert one at Hook House. Another portrait, exactly the same features show up. Also, the shape of the nose differs. But finally, if we look at the lip, the two ones of Charles Calvert, the lower lip comes and there's kind of a little uptick right in the middle. It's flat across on the other man. I suggest to you, all of this implies this is not Lord Baltimore. Anyway, what do we know about Charles Calvert? He came to Maryland in 1661, early 2, was the governor from 62 to 75, became Lord Baltimore in 75, of course, at the death of his father. He lived here at St. John's in the early years and later used it as an entertainment facility. He then moved to Patuxent River at Mattaponi Sewell, where he lived for the rest of his time in Maryland, and there's been some work on that building. In 1684, he returned to England to defend Maryland from William Penn and the Charter. Unfortunately, not being present, he left deputies in charge, and things fell apart in 1689. Of course, there was the rebellion by the Protestants, and he lost control of Maryland, unfortunately. He no longer had political power, but he did still get the rents and things from the colony. So this is the portrait by Kellner of our Charles Calvert. So please. Thank you.
Yes. And Sir Gottfried Kneller, who is baronet, who was given the title of baronet in England because he was also very, very important there. He becomes the most important person after Van Dyck and Soest in England. And he actually will be a court painter for a number of different regions. But when you look at him, once again, first and foremost, he's from Germany. So once again, an imported painter. The British don't trust their painters for quite some time. Until well into the 18th century, they rely on these imported artists. And it's very interesting when you consider British painting. I studied initially in my life English literature before I became an art historian. And when I became an art historian, my desire was somehow to connect my love of 17th century art with my love of 17th century English literature, because it's the best, right? I couldn't find anything in England. British art before 18th century is not much to talk about. And even they're correct, I mean, so even their portrait painters have to come from elsewhere. And if you look at this young man, very, very distinguished looking young man in this self-portrait, you can see that he looks pretty Dutch, Flemish in style. And yes, that's because even though he came from northern Germany, he studied under a student of Rembrandt, Ferdinand Bol, and possibly under Rembrandt himself. He may have been one of the last students of Rembrandt in the early 1660s. And he went to Venice, yes, then goes to England in 1676. He paints Louis XIV for Charles II as a portrait gift. And then he's both a portrait painter to James II, George I, William and Mary's principal portrait, knighted in 1692, and then he got honorary doctorate of law from the University of Oxford, and he became a knight of the Holy Roman Empire in 1700. Why is this important for us? It's important because painters during this time are still considered as craftsmen and artisans. It was, Van Dyck had been knighted, Rubens had been knighted, but those are truly exceptional people. So painters are trying very hard to advance the notion that art of painting is a noble art, and that nobility of the art of painting is also expressed in the nobility that they imbue in their portrayal of these different people. So here I'm just comparing our Lord with 4th Baron Cornwallis, also by the same artist. And you can see we have the big wigs, we have French style. I already mentioned the portrait of Louis XIV coming to England. So the idea is that English are not alone in this. Late 17th century, there is French taste sweeps throughout Northern Europe. So German courts, English court to some degree, the Dutch all go for this French taste. So the late Baroque going towards Rococo, and this is the introduction of this super luxurious attire, even greater sense of self-possession. And of course, once again, all of those codes are still present. The hat is at the table, but arm akimbo, but look at this cloak vis-a-vis that nice, simple, dark cloak we saw early on. There is too much money at this moment. There is too much money. So Kneller also portrayed Isaac Newton on several occasions, and it's fascinating to see the difference in the portrayal. This is capturing likeness of a scientist, and he's very simple in his attire. All that matters is the concentration, the gaze in the face, the character of the sitter. Whereas when you go to the Lord, it's the status. I mean, he is a role model, a public figure, a presence, but we are not that much interested in his individual self and personality. This is a profoundly public portrait of might and majesty. So that's the idea and the main difference here.
This is of the fourth Lord Baltimore, who is Benedict Leonard Calvert. He is the only Lord Baltimore to be born in Maryland. He was also governor, beginning at the age of 5. He was so amazing. No. He was appointed age of 5 to hold the position until he was age of 10. And he was governor during the Revolution, of course, because deputies were running the colony at that point. After the Glorious Revolution, he went to France, was with James II for a while, educated there, then came back to England, converted to the Church of England in 1713, and very soon thereafter was elected to the House of Commons. Charles Calvert dies on the 21st of February, 1715, and he immediately becomes the fourth Lord Baltimore. He very soon thereafter begins appealing to the new king, George I, for a return of the power of over the colony. But in May 15th, in a very quick, untimely death, he succumbs, and his son becomes the next one. Now, he's wearing peer robes of the Lord.
Yes.
Crest of Maryland is on the side. I don't think it would have been possible to paint that prior to his becoming Lord Baltimore, which would put this into a very narrow time frame. And he's also holding a book.
Yes.
It's not labeled, but I have a suggestion of what that is. This is from his son, another Benedict Leonard, who, while at Oxford at Christ Church, became friends of Thomas Hearns, who kept a marvelous diary of everything going on. And in February of 1718, 3 years after this man died, he wrote, Mr. Calvert hath a printed Horace, which belonged to his father, who was an excellent and elegant poet, and a great admirer of Horace, of which he had about 35 different editions. If the idea of a fan, i.e. somebody who collects all the Beatles records or something like that would have existed then, he was a fan of Horace. I suggest that is indeed the book, and this is part of the family lore because Philip Calvert, the man in the lead coffin, in his library also has 2 copies of the poet Horace. So that's something part of the Calvert family. And what I find most interesting about this, he's saying that the fourth Lord Baltimore was an excellent and elegant poet. Where is his poetry? Does any survive? That's a mystery we should investigate. So anyway, this is the fourth. You didn't want to say too much about him.
No,
We'll go on.
but I just love this idea of Horace, that you're suggesting that he may be holding the book of Horace.
Right.
Horace was very big in England,
Oh,
I
yes,
mean,
yes.
throughout the continent
Yes, he
at
was.
this time.
Yeah.
The Horatian odes and all kinds of imitators of Horace.
Right.
So he's a wonderful figure for the introduction of this neoclassical spirit in
Absolutely.
poetry. So it would make perfect sense that you suggest that it could be a copy of Horace, especially if Horace had such prominence in that family.
Right, right.
But the other thing is that, yes, he relates to the previous portrait very closely in terms of his attire
Careful.
from the third Lord Baltimore, but of course much more ceremonial in standing, and that arma kimbo, authority above us, etc., etc. And what happens in the fourth Lord Baltimore, which we don't have an artist for, and as I said, it's not a great painting per se, but what's nice is that despite that sense of authority, there is also a sense of walking, movement, a slightly greater sense of informality is introduced in this portrait. You also have that view into the distance, that kind of merging of interior and exterior. And the distance, of course, is important because if you have the coat of arms of Maryland there at the base of the table, that is again disclosed by curtain. So performance, Maryland is here under that table. He sits on top of Maryland with his head, but at the same time the distance signifies that distance between England and the New World, perhaps, the distant landscape that you see behind, right? As an idea.
Right.
But it's very nice that this is formal, yet with a little bit of a personal touch, especially with the book. This is not a guy who is so invested in power, but learning first and foremost, which would be something that you find in a humanist portrait, but not necessarily in somebody who wants to govern, right?
Why would you say that that is an inferior portrait?
Inferior stylistically speaking. I just feel the way that the portrait painter portrayed the face, kind of like the contours around the face, the lines around the face, a certain sense of flatness there in the face. I'm thinking that there is, even though he's moving, he doesn't feel fully integrated in the background, almost like a figure that's a cutout and placed in the background. The best way to do that would be to see it really in situ, in the portrait itself. So I think that the previous one, even though I don't like it because of the great formality, is a better portrait. But we can notice that much better in the handling of the painting itself.
Seminar after the lecture.
Yeah, we'll have
Yeah,
a little
yeah,
observation
Okay.
of the techniques,
Okay.
Is it possible it could be a posthumous portrait?
You know, I thought of that too. Is it possible that it could be a posthumous portrait?
They had like a smaller miniature.
I know,
That's
I know,
possible.
that's possible.
Right.
I didn't want to speculate that far, but since you mentioned it, there was a custom of creating posthumous portraits in England. And not only in England, Van Dyck was famous for his posthumous portraits.
Right. And the fact
So-
that his period of Lord Baltimore was only a few months
Exactly.
would go with that idea.
Would go that this is
Very
like
nicely.
they needed it for the sequence. They
Right.
needed it, but this
Exactly.
is the young man who came from Oxford, didn't manage to really govern as a Lord Baltimore just for a few months. It is possible, quite
Right.
possible,
That's a
that
very
it's a
good point.
posthumous portrait.
Very good point.
Thank you.
Yes, indeed. So he lives very short amount of time. His son, the second Charles Calvert, becomes the next Lord Baltimore. He was underage at the time, and this is a petition that he or his guardian had printed to convince the king to give Maryland back to the family. And of course, it was successful, and he regained control of Maryland in 1721. But immediately there was the guardian had not been very careful with finances. He had difficulty. He sold Kipling Hall to Christopher Crowe, and that's the one when it was lost for £7,000. A good amount of money at that time period. He also is the only other Lord Baltimore who came to Maryland in 1632 to try to settle issues. And there was a war literally going on between Pennsylvania and Maryland settlers at that time. Where is the boundary? So Baltimore thought he settled it by meeting with the sons of Penn, and they had a map that they agreed was the boundary. Problem was, they had given him a false map. Soon thereafter, he contested it, and this continued all the way down until the 1760s. As you see here, there's three lines. There's the Pennsylvania claim at the bottom. There's the one that eventually became the Mason and Dixon line in the middle, but the original boundary goes all the way up past Philadelphia. So we own Philadelphia, by gosh. Okay. In any case, but he also became attached to the heir to the throne, the Prince of Wales, Frederick, and became very close friends with him. This was the father of George II, or son of George II. He should have been the next king, but he didn't live long enough. But building that royal connection, Charles had all kinds of opportunities. He was the gentleman of the bedchamber, coiffeur of the Prince of Wales household, which means assistant treasurer, member of Parliament for a long time, Surveyor General, Royal Society, a Lord of the Admiralty, and member of the Trinity House, which was a seaman's support group. He is, next to George Calvert, is the one who had the most public service of any of the Lords Baltimore. And he would have continued, except the year 1751 was a bad year. The Duke of Wales got hit in the head with a cricket ball and died as a result. Who knew cricket was so dangerous? He died a few months later. So that connection completely disappeared and left it to his son. So I want to now let you talk
Yes.
a little bit about this.
Look at that. Transformation. Transformation. He's outside, okay, that's simple. He's also walking a little bit or moving a little bit. He's still dressed in wonderfully luxurious dress, attire. He has this classical facade leading into a garden. And it's this idea of the boundary between the palatial or the urban and the rural. And I think this is a kind of thing that you find also in some of the great Rubens portraits, or you find it in some of the Van Dyck portraits that we have here. But it also talks about the sense that these people have the active and contemplative life, or combine that kind of urban engagement or the life in the palace at the court with that interest in the land. So it's kind of important to keep that in mind. What we have regarding this particular portrait painter of Charles Calvert is another self-portrait of Alan Ramsay. And this is the first time that we have a non-Dutch or German painter painting somebody. So it's kind of important in that sense, historically speaking. He's a Scottish portrait painter who became very, very well known internationally. As you can see, he went to this Academy of St. Luke in Edinburgh. He went to Italy. Of course, everybody had to go in Italy. Grand Tour, 18th century. Visited Rome, studied at the French Academy in Rome, went to Naples. Then he even had a lot of portraits done by the British expats who were living in Italy at that time. He came and also went back to Edinburgh quite regularly, even though he was established in London. And George III appointed him as the royal painter. So Ramsay is extremely important artist in the second half of the 18th century, and one of the first here that we can see who is asked to paint high nobility and who is native, so to speak. Unfortunately, he had an injury to his right arm and he couldn't paint after 1773. These are just a couple of other portraits when he became the court painter of George III. Yes, yes. You see how French the English became? I mean, this is like Louis XIV or Louis XVI. I mean, this is as French as it gets in the English portraiture. And almost unseemly level of luxury, and the elevation on that oriental carpet and then a pedestal furthermore, so that the cloak can drape ever more gloriously. And of course, columns, just to keep the columns in mind behind these people. Oftentimes you will see a single column or two columns. This goes back to a much older Renaissance tradition where even the Virgin Mary sometimes, who is approached by people, will be painted against a large column. And the symbolism is that they are the pillars of whatever may be at stake. The pillar of the kingdom, or in particularly here with the Lord Baltimore, the pillar for the state of Maryland, or for Maryland as part of the kingdom. So this is not insignificant that you have these columns singled out behind these people. They may look nice and human and soft in their exchange with us and approachable, and then you see the big column behind them to tell you who they actually are. But this is a good example of how English portraiture evolves in the 18th century. And then this particular one, which we talked about a little bit, right? It's a little bit of an issue with the slaves, correct? As Henry correctly points out, this was from the website here of Maryland of the State House, but actually this is the 5th Lord Baltimore as a child at age 5 with one of his family's slaves, and you would know a lot more about that. The interesting thing, of course, is that the boy is well dressed, like that African servant we saw earlier. And yes, of course, in this case, even though they're children, and this may have been a little boy chosen to be his friend, companion, and he's interesting because he's exotic, correct? So he's dressed up like him, but you see how even in portrayal of children, a hierarchy has to be maintained. So this kid who is the companion needs to be kneeling down and looking up. So we're looking at a small kid, but because somebody else in the picture is looking up, we know that he is important. So these are just small things, but they tell you about how important this notion of legacy, continuity, connection to the new world is for all of these people. And that's just one more of those Ramsey portraits, just to tell you that they still pop up at auctions. And this was just an example of, in October last year, a Ramsey portrait was sold for not that much, actually. So if you're fortunate, if there are not too many bidders, you can still get very good portraits at auctions of these 18th century painters.
All right. So this is the final Lord Baltimore Friedrich. Frederick County, named for him, of course. He took charge of the colony in 1752 after his father's death. He was a big spender, loved travel, especially Italy, had a number of children, most of whom were illegitimate, including Henry Hartford, who he designated as the last Baltimore, and Hartford County named for him. To his credit, he did support all of his children throughout his life and was a really intriguing man. He had a lot of income, both from Maryland and from the Bank of England, investments there. And give you a sense, look at 1670. There was only 11,400 people in Maryland at that time. Poor Cecil Calvert really didn't get a lot of reward from Maryland during his life because there was rents and there was fees and hogshead fees and stuff. He didn't have much. But by the time his son Charles was here, 34,000, but look at the boom in population. By the 1660s and 70s, almost 200,000 people here. There was an immense amount of income coming here. Some estimate that Lord Baltimore VI was receiving as much as over 100,000 pounds sterling a year. That is a lot of money. Frederick used Maryland mostly as a source of revenue, but he did appoint very significant governors, two that were really outstanding. Horatio Sharp, who managed the French and Indian War here, and Robert Eden, the man who married his sister Caroline, and the first baronet of Maryland. And I think it's highly appropriate that those paintings are in there, because it was due to the Eden family that they were maintained as a group until we required them. And it is Eden in 1772 who laid the cornerstone for this very building. So that seems highly appropriate here. The only real physical surviving thing of the 6th Lord Baltimore is Fort Frederick, a wonderful Vauban design fort out in western Maryland, of course, Frederick County. He was named Frederick because of the good friend of his father, the Prince of Wales. He also saw himself as something of a writer intellectual. He published a number of volumes, some of which elaborately illustrated with beautiful copper plates and stuff. That was really expensive to produce at the time. He also produced a very well-discussed volume, A Tour of the East, in the year 1763-64, with remarks on the city of Constantinople and on the Turks. Well discussed. Even writers as notable as James Boswell commented on this. In 1667, he said, Baltimore has had a very good opportunity to know something of Eastern manners. He is a man of singular independence and whim. He lived at Constantinople, wore the dress of the country, kept his seraglio of the finest women, and in short, enjoyed the existence of a Turk. He was also a poet, and this is the last poetry he published, and it's interesting that it was found in the archive, in the library of Henry Hartford, the man he designated as the last Lord Baltimore. But much of his effort was spent on Woodcote Park in Surrey. This was the home inherited by Charles Calvert from his grandmother Anne Minn's family, and was the seat of the Lords Baltimore in the 18th century. Frederick spent immense amount of money on this building in the 1650s and 60s. These are 1920s photographs showing the French influence, the elegance of the interior. Unfortunately, this building was sold. It was later purchased by the British Automobile Association and burned down in 1936. But here in America, there's a piece of it, because in the 1920s, they sold off one of the rooms to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and that room still survives in Boston. It is magnificent, and it gives you a sense of the ceiling, beautiful artwork that decorated everything. This was a very sumptuous piece of architecture there. Unfortunately, he went into trouble, and 1668 was not a good year for him. There was a number of charges against him. This became the equivalent of a social media scandal of the time. Throughout England, he was acquitted of all the charges, but decided he'd had enough. He sold Woodcote Park and went to the continent, and that's when his sister got the paintings and took them to County Durham. He traveled to Russia, again to Turkey, finally ended up in Italy, where he died in 1771, designating Henry Harford as the 7th Lord Baltimore. That was accepted in England, but it wasn't accepted in America after the Revolution. So this is his painting, and I think the books behind him make perfect sense given his literary ambitions. So after
Absolutely.
you'd like to talk.
This man wasn't interested in governance.
No.
This man wasn't interested in being a statesman in any way, in taking care of this, earthly duties, so to speak. He was interested in books. He was an adventurer. As you heard, he traveled extensively. He had this extremely unconventional lifestyle. So you can see that he's like a typical, I would say, French noble at this point. I mean, we talked about the French taste in his interior, and when you look at this portrait of the 6th Lord Baltimore, who of course is portrayed by a foreign artist once again, Johann Ludwig Tieck, around 1750, I'm reminded of the age of the dangerous liaisons in French, and that kind of elegance and ease of manners and a license that nobility takes. So the pre-revolutionary France, in a certain sense. And if you see, we have another German painter. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a good self-portrait of Johann Ludwig Tieck, but I can show you a couple of portraits that he painted, who studied in Berlin. So the worldliness of the 6th Lord is exemplified by this wide reach, so to speak. He also traveled in London. He painted miniatures there. And he was recommended by the Princess of Wales to the court of Gotha, where he was a court painter in 1748, recorded. Look at this portrait. These little Africans come into all these portraits everywhere. In other words, it's not just something that we find in a couple of portraits here at the State House. It's a fad. It's a fashion in European portraiture to have these servant slash page boys who appear to accompany the nobility. And here, for example, you have just a comparison, formal comparison with this Eugenius von Savoy, and you can see that kind of, if you will, arrogance that's implicit in the portrait of the 6th Lord Baltimore, despite the fact that he doesn't have a hat sitting on the table, but the books is part of the manner of this portrait painter. Once again, you see the African person behind, so this is almost an attribute that's constantly inserted. And this was kind of interesting. After the designs by Smith, there was just 2 plates from one of those Oriental books that, like, he wrote about Constantinople, but the book about the dresses and attires of the Turks. This was, of course, also very fashionable in this long age of exploration in Europe. And Turkey and the Ottoman Empire would continue to fascinate them all the way until the end of the 19th century. And he did have his own seraglio or harem, yes, and he traveled with these women. Apparently at one point he had 8, another time there were 16 of them traveling. And when there was an anecdote that when he was stopped somewhere at the border with his harem, they said, "Sir, which one of these is your wife?" Out of the 8 women he traveled with, and he said, "I'm an Englishman. That question doesn't apply to me." This was a French person asking him. He tried to get away with the notion of traveling with 8 women. So, I just want to go back quickly, since we are getting close to our conclusion, and look at them side by side. The 1st Lord Baltimore, just for the sense of that evolution we spoke about. The 2nd Lord Baltimore, just so you remember how they're moving along from that kind of more restrained, Dutch-influenced, I'm going to say, Protestant, Calvinist almost aesthetic, of the dark robes, of course, you have the nice lace collar, but it's very restrained to these people, right? The third Lord Baltimore and the fourth Lord Baltimore, who are very, very similar. And of course, as we said, this could be a posthumous. Thank you for that suggestion again. And then Ramsey continues in that tradition that goes towards neoclassicism, that kind of Baroque, Rococo, and now moving towards ever greater emphasis on architecture and this superiority of standing and pose. And then, of course, if you compare the first and the last, you have very similar structure and composition, but with two very, very different people, both in terms of the attire and the attributes that they choose for themselves. And I would say that Meitens is definitely a much better portrait painter than this Johann Ludwig Titz. And the thing is that Johann Ludwig Titz also painted some better portraits, but in this case, you probably couldn't get hold of the sixth Lord Baltimore for a very long time. Sometimes you have to keep in mind that a portrait will depend on the willingness of the sitter to sit with you.
Right.
And if this guy is an adventurer who is constantly somewhere, and he kind of sends him a little sketch, or poor portrait painter has to work from a little sketch that was left behind him while he was going off to Turkey. So he creates this rather stiff and uninspired portrait. So keep in mind that the presence or the absence of the sitter can affect the quality of what comes out. So that's my
Very
little
good
point at the end.
Very good point. So, we have hanging here in the State House a absolutely remarkable group of portraiture. There's nothing like it anywhere else in the United States. The complete series of colonial proprietors over a 150-year time frame. They are, again, a unique dynasty in the history of the entire Americas, and these portraits give us an insight into the men who shaped the colony and now the state of Maryland. We thank you for your time.